Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I got a quick video for you today. I got a couple new colors in the mail from Anbernic for the RG35XXSP. Now there are 3 new color models. I only have 2 of them here, the transparent red and the transparent green, but they've also made a transparent white. This brings the total number of color options that we have for these devices up to 7 altogether. I've also got a couple older models. I've got the transparent blue as well as the metallic silver. Now the silver one I've done a button mod on, so it's a little bit softer, but this one is exactly how it shipped to me back when I did my first review. So in addition to just looking at the new colors, I am going to take these apart and see if there have been any changes at the hardware level and whether or not the experience has changed from back in the original review to today. At the very least, it's just another opportunity for me to talk about one of my favorite handhelds of the year, and so I'm very excited to check these out, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start by unboxing the transparent red model, and as you can see, we have all the different color options right here. Now, as far as I can tell, inside the box, nothing has changed whatsoever. So we have the device, and then underneath that, we've got a screen protector, some wet wipes, as well as a quick instruction manual. It also comes with a USB-C to USB-A cable for charging. Now, a quick public service announcement that I like to do with this device and all the other cheap ones that come from Anbernic: the charging on these can be a little wonky. And there's a lot of discussion about this on Reddit and other places. I'll leave a couple of them linked down below if you want to learn more. But long story short, my general recommendation when it comes to charging these devices is to use a USB-C to USB-A cable like the one that comes with it, and also use a low-powered charging brick. In fact, if you look at the back of basically any Anbernic device, it'll say the exact charge that it's looking for. In the case of the RG35XXSP and others in the same line, you can see that it's requiring 5 volts and 1.5 amps. And you might already have one of these charging bricks already in your house, you know, like the cheaper ones for cell phones, but I'll also leave a link to one on Amazon in case you want to get the exact measurement that'll work for this device. There have been a couple issues that I've seen with this device. Number one is people using chargers that are not up to spec, like a fast charger for a modern phone, and that will sometimes overheat the device. But there have also been times when the components on the device, which are admittedly cheap considering these are budget devices, have failed on the device, which have caused overheating as well. Long story short, my big caveat here with this device and all the other cheap devices that I review on this channel: make sure that you're charging it up to spec. As far as whether or not one of these cheap components will actually fail on the device, who really knows at that point, but my recommendation in that regard is to charge it while you still have an eye on it. In other words, I don't recommend charging these devices in another room or while you're asleep. And my last point about this is that there's always a risk when buying any electronics device, a high-end phone or a cheap handheld like this, but obviously the cheaper devices might have more risk by virtue of just having, less of a QC process, or maybe just having cheaper components as well. And so every device will have some risk, but I don't think that the SP in particular has any more risk than any others from Anbernic. With all of that out of the way, let's actually take a look at the red device. And I gotta say, this is the one I was most excited for because I like the idea of having the transparent red offset by really nice black buttons. And sure enough, yeah, I think it looks excellent. I love the contrast here between these two colors. You can see that the transparency on this device is a little bit on the smoky side, which is pretty typical with Anbernic. Most of their transparent devices will look like this. So it's not that you can totally see the components underneath, but more like a hint of them, and I think that's pretty cool too. The device is using a white PCB, which makes everything look a little bit brighter, and I kind of like that as well. And one difference I noted, especially on the back here, is they used to just use a transparent tape here on the back, and it looked kind of ugly with some of these devices, but now it looks like they're using transparent tape dots. And so now you can see 6 little dots right here that are holding the battery into place. I think that looks a lot cleaner than just a piece of tape across the front. And this was the same thing with the transparent blue one when it first launched, but I didn't really see it because it's so dark compared to the red one, which I think is just a little bit easier to see. Now, the only device I really have to compare against when it comes to transparent red and black is going to be the Retroid Pocket Flip, which came out last year. This one also has a smoky color, but maybe a little bit more transparent than the other, and obviously it's a completely different device. This is Android based, and this one also has analog sliders, whereas the 35XXSP does not. Either way, you can see color-wise they are almost identical between the two. I really wish I had like a Nintendo 64 controller to compare against, but as it stands, I still think this is a really nice color. And here's a look at the green one. So this one has got just a really bright, vibrant color as well, but it has gray buttons instead of black. Same thing here, we have a white PCB, which makes this one look pretty bright. In fact, I think that this one looks a lot brighter than the red one. It may also have to do with these gray buttons, but I'm not really sure. Now, each of these devices have black borders, which I like. I briefly owned the DMG version of the 35XXSP, and then I gifted it to a friend. But one of the things I didn't like about that device is that it had gray bezels around the screen, which really made it pop out more. And so it felt like we had double bezels, including both the outer rim, but then also the bezel inside of the LCD. It's still the same amount of bezel with the black borders, but I feel like this one just fades in a little bit better into the screen directly. So let's do a quick rundown of all the components here and what you can expect from the 35XXSP. We'll start with the left side, so we have our volume up and down, and then up top we've got our shoulder and trigger buttons, then a USB-C charging port as well as for accessories, and then finally a mini HDMI output. So if you do want to connect your device to a television, you can totally do that. You will need an adapter though for mini HDMI. On the right side, we have a power and reset button, and then on the bottom, we've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, and then 2 SD card slots. And generally how this works is you use your first one for your firmware, and then the second one will be for your games. However, with these devices out of the box, it's going to come with a 64GB card, and this will come with both the stock firmware as well as a bunch of games. And then finally on the back, we've got our battery compartment, and then some information here on the front, and you can unscrew this compartment if you ever need to change out the battery. Looking at the controls themselves, we have the D-pad, face button, start and select, and then a menu button. And I think the big question that probably everyone is asking is whether or not these buttons have been changed at all. If you remember from the original review units, I found that these buttons were just a little bit too hard to press down on and very loud. So let's go ahead and do a test between the two and see if we can feel any sort of difference between them. Now bear in mind, this is a very non-scientific test. The idea here is that I'm going to press down on the button, and then when I feel it actuating, I'm going to measure how many grams of pressure that was. And so it's definitely not an exact science, but it'll at least give us an impression of how hard these buttons are to press down on. And so in doing this test, I feel like as soon as it actuates, it's around 120 grams of pressure. And again, it's really hard to tell, and this is just a kitchen scale that I bought for like $20 on Amazon, so not the best way of judging this at all. But yeah, I feel like between 120 and 130 grams of force is required to push down the button. And it feels very similar with the D-pad as well. About 120 grams is what I would say. Now by contrast, I have an original Game Boy Advance SP. This is reshelled with an updated shell, but all the same, the buttons and the membranes should be original. And for this, it feels like I need to press down somewhere between like 60 and 80 grams of force. And bear in mind also, I don't remember the numbers that I used the last time I did a review like this, so they might be off. Again, this is all up to just my own individual interpretation. Either way, the original SP definitely has a lighter click to it and is very satisfying. Okay, and so here we go with the new models, and full disclosure here, when I got that DMG model, which was a retail unit that came out maybe a few months after the original review units that I had, it definitely felt a little bit softer as well. And so I'm expecting that these ones are going to feel very similar. And yeah, sure enough, it feels like it takes about 80 or 90 grams of force. This is actually pretty awesome. So it does feel like the new models are a bridge between the original one, which was too much force, and then also the really lightweight feel of the SP buttons. Ideally, I would rather have something really lightweight like this, but honestly, I think that what we have right here is pretty great. So even though one of my main complaints about the original SP was that it felt a little bit fatiguing over time, I feel like this is not going to be an issue here. In fact, even after doing a tape mod on this device, and I've got a whole video about that, this one is now softer and quieter, but still requires more force than this retail one right here. So I think this is probably the best place to be, where we don't really have to do a tape mod. It already feels really great. So definitely some sort of change happened here under the hood, because this is a lot easier to press down on. It feels great. Let me give you a quick audio sample of the D-pad and face buttons so you can hear what they sound like. Now it does seem that the start and select buttons are still the same as they were before. They are still loud and clicky. So hopefully you can hear the difference between the two. I would say that these new models are about half the loudness of the original review units that I had. And also bear in mind that this is not going to be exclusive to these models. It does seem like there has been a refresh altogether across all the different colors. And so even if you buy a metallic silver one today, it should still have the same kind of buttons as we have on this one. Now, one other thing worth noting about these transparent models, and it was the same with the blue one, is that you can put a sticker between the shell and the actual screen over here. It will require you to take the screen apart, so you have to take off these little nubs and then actually get inside of there. But once you do that, and you've got a sticker that fits here perfectly, it's a really nice way to customize your device. And I show how to do that in one of my other SP videos in case you want to try it yourself. Okay, so next I want to do a teardown and just see if there's been any component change between this one and the original review units. And one thing worth noting, my best friend Zoo over at Retro Handhelds, he already made a video the other day about the green model that he got. And there's a couple things worth noting in his video. The first is that he did have a Nintendo 64 controller to compare against. And you can see that yes, the colors are not a one-for-one replica of the Nintendo 64 controllers, but are pretty close. Also in his teardown, he didn't really see a difference between the rubber membranes or the buttons either. But even though he is definitely my best friend in the whole wide world, I don't really trust anything he says. And so we're going to take it apart ourselves and see if I can find any differences myself. Now, the other thing worth noting is that my other best friend, which is Linus Tech Tips, they sent me their screwdriver kit. And in full disclosure here, I did not pay for this. They just offered to send it over to me, but of course, this is not like a sponsored or anything else like that. And for years, I've been using the iFixit Pro Tech Toolkit. This has been like my #1 thing that I've used in all my teardowns probably for about 3 years now. And this thing is like a full-on kit, so you have a bunch of different tools beyond just the screwdriver itself, but you do have a screwdriver kit as well. But in today's teardown, I'm going to use the Linus one just to see how much I like it compared to the iFixit one that I already have. Of note, this kit costs about $75 on Amazon, but they also just sell the screwdriver kit itself for $40. So if you're looking for just a screwdriver kit, you can get it from them. And according to the LTTstore.com, this kit right here costs $50. So it's $10 more than the iFixit one. And here's a look at the Linus screwdriver itself, and they actually put my name on it. That's pretty awesome. So it says Retro Game Co. right here. And this is made out of metal. It feels very sturdy, and it also spins here on the bottom. So what you do is usually you'll palm this, and then you can screw like this by rotating while still keeping it pressed against your palm for stability. And this is the same with basically any other precision screwdriver. Now this case is pretty neat. It's magnetic and opens up like this, and then obviously you've got a space for your screwdriver as well. And there's probably some other major differences here between like whatever bits they have available, but in general, I just use like Phillips and then maybe some hex ones. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is that these bits are longer than the ones from iFixit. So if you have anything with like a deeper hole in it, this will probably work out better. Otherwise, I think it's a pretty neat little kit here, and thanks to Linus for sending this out. You're a really great best friend. Okay, I might need to take that back. So I was trying to use the 1.5 hex bit, which is right here. This is the one that should work with this device, but unfortunately it's too big. And if you look at it, it's about the same size as the 2 hex bit. So it does look like I have 2 different bits that are of the same size as opposed to having 1.5 and 2. Now, thankfully, you can also use a T6 Torx screw. It's not going to be a perfect fit, but it'll still work for what we're trying to do here today in just opening up a cheap device. Either way, it is kind of a bummer that the 1 hex bit that I actually need is the one that's screwed up. And just to make sure that I'm not taking crazy pills here, yes, a 1.5 hex from this iFixit kit absolutely fits perfectly. Now, because I'm probably going to be keeping the red one as my main device going forward, I'm going to open up the green one in case I screw something up. And for this teardown, in addition to the hex screws, underneath you will have the motherboard or PCB that you'll have to remove, and that requires a Phillips screwdriver. Either way, let's go ahead and take this guy apart. Okay, one other quick note to make. This isn't like a screwdriver review, but I did want to mention here, just in case my best friend Linus is watching, it does feel like this grippy part right here should be a little bit higher up. When I'm holding the screwdriver like this, which is often the way that I will do it when I'm unscrewing a device, I found that my fingers don't totally grip the grippy part, but instead way up here. And so I found even just with these 4 screws that my fingers were slipping a little bit more than I would like. And I don't really have that issue with the iFixit one because the grippiness goes a lot further back, and so I'm able to hold it like this. It's super comfortable. And so that's the one criticism I have right here, is that I wish that the grippiness went all the way back to about here. Either way, now that we've got the screws off, it's just a matter of pulling this apart. And then I'm also going to unseat the battery. If you want, you can take the battery out from this component, but I'm going to keep it just as it is. Either way, it's just a quick little connector here that you disconnect from right here. Now, the next thing you're probably going to notice about this device is this little piece of paper right here. And this was also not on the original review units, but once people started having some issues about the fact that the CPU is right here and the battery was right underneath, they added this. And this right here is called fish paper. So this is a cheaper way of basically having an insulator between electrical components. And this really doesn't have anything to do with the heat transfer from the CPU over to the battery, but rather this is supposed to reduce any sort of flare-ups. So for example, if one of these components shorted out and it made like a little flare-up, it wouldn't reach the battery because you would have this here instead. And one thing worth noting about the CPU and the battery being so close to it, a lot of people did some testing on the CPU, and they found that the max temperature that the CPU got is still within norms of what the battery can tolerate. And so the risk of this CPU setting your battery on fire is basically nil. Now that being said, any heat being pushed into a battery is not going to be great over the long term, and so it may degrade the battery over time. And so what that means is that maybe years from now, the battery itself will lose its charge. And so at that point, you would have to replace your battery, and I'm hoping that Anbernic would have the solution at that point. But the honest reality is, at least based on what I've seen over the past few years, by the time a battery actually would die on this device, Anbernic will have released like 20 different handhelds by then. And so the opportunity of getting a specific battery that fits this specific device will probably not be so great in the years to come. Anyway, this is not supposed to be all doom and gloom, but just the reality of a cheap handheld device from a small manufacturer. Either way, other than the fish paper that we saw between the battery and the CPU, I don't really see any major difference with the board. It now does have a different date and version number. It used to be version 3.0 and it used to be March of 2024. But it does look like shortly after release, they did update this PCB. So now I've also removed the side buttons that were over here. And so now let's actually get underneath the board. And again, for this, you'll need a Phillips head screwdriver. I would recommend a 00. After that, we can just take the board off very carefully because we have that ribbon cable underneath. So this is connecting the screen to the PCB, and I'm not even going to mess with it. So here we are. We can actually see the rubber membranes and the buttons underneath. And so my guess here is that the type of rubber that they're using with this rubber membrane is just a little bit softer than it was previously. But overall, the general design is still the same. So we have each of these buttons with little studs at each end, and then these will push into the rubber membrane, which will then press on the domes underneath. Now, one thing I have heard is that after repeated usage of maybe pressing down a button a lot, that some of these domes have been punctured by the nubs underneath. So this means that these little spikes right here are going through the rubber membrane and then pushing onto the dome and puncturing it. Now, personally, I haven't experienced that, even on my device here, which I have been using non-stop for about 6 months at this point. But also bear in mind that I put a couple layers of tape on mine, so it's a little bit more secured. Either way, I've only seen it happen a few times, and so it's something to be on the lookout for. If you have a button that just kind of starts to feel like it's not bouncing back, that's probably what happened with your device. And again, there's going to be a risk with any of these cheaper devices, so I'm just kind of going through all the bad things that could happen with your device and how you could fix them. Either way, as it stands, it seems like the overall design has not changed in any way. My guess here is there have been slight differences either to the material that they're using for the rubber membrane or the actual height of these little spikes. I think one of those two components is making it so that these buttons feel a little bit softer. Now, one thing worth noting, if you wanted to make these start and select buttons a little bit quieter because they are still very loud on this device, you can add a couple layers of electrical tape right here. And I show how to do that in my tape mod video. I'm not going to do that here with this device right now because honestly, I just don't press these start and select buttons that often to make it that big of a deal. So I'm going to go ahead and put everything back together, and I've got a couple more tests that I want to do. You know, in the assembly part, one thing I noticed is that there used to be a little piece of plastic right here that would jut out, and it would go inside a little slot right here in the shell. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing that right here. In fact, it looks like it's been just straight up cut off from these devices. So I guess Anbernic made some sort of decision where it didn't want that piece of plastic. That's the only main difference I've seen so far. Either way, it's not that big of a deal. It just means you have to set the button inside and then be a little bit careful when you actually put the rest of the case on. I feel like the shell itself is secure enough to hold the button in place anyway. And yeah, sure enough, once I put everything back together, they feel nice and secure. Now, one other thing I forgot to do previously, let's do a quick rattle test. So I'm going to shake this. And here it is compared to the review unit that I had originally. So it does feel like these buttons are a little bit more secure, but still, you know, they have a bit of a cheap feeling to them altogether. So honestly, no complaints when it comes to the overall updates to this device. I think that they have taken steps to improve the overall look and feel. Now, one other thing worth noting, they sent over this little leather pouch thing. Now, this is not real leather, it's fake leather, but it's supposed to basically work with your SP. And it's a pretty snug fit. You can see here that you kind of have to squeeze it in, but it's got a nice magnetic clasp to it, and it has the Anbernic logo up top. Now, personally, I don't use a case with my clamshells. This thing is thick enough as it is, and so I don't want to make it any thicker by adding extra protection to it. I'm also of the philosophy that a clamshell is protection itself against the buttons as well as the screen. And honestly, I don't mind if it gets dinged up. I think that's just a badge of honor. But if you're trying to keep your device pristine, this might be one of the slimmer ways that you can do it. One thing of note is the stitching on here is pretty lame. Like you can see if I get really close that it's pretty cheap looking. So if you are looking for something that's really like artisan built, this is definitely not it. It's obviously a cheap thing from a warehouse. And they sell it for $10, so it's not a huge investment either way, but definitely an option if you are trying to keep your device nice and clean. For my part, like I mentioned, I don't really plan on using this case at all. The clamshell itself is protection enough. Okay, so last moment of truth here. Let's just do a quick software test and take a look at the stock firmware and whether or not my custom firmware will also work on one of these newer devices. So here's a look at the stock operating system, and it looks identical to what it has been previously. But if we go into the firmware version, you can see that it's version 1.0.7 from August 30th of this year. Now this release is after they got what they call the low power standby. This means that if you put the device to sleep, which you can do by just closing the lid and basically having these two magnets touch each other, once these two magnets connect, it'll put it to sleep. And I found that the low power sleep mode on these new devices with the new firmware is excellent. In fact, with other devices, I found that, leaving it for like 4 hours only loses like 1% battery. And it is really nice to be able to just open it up and go directly back into the device. Now, in addition to just the regular old sleep mode, there are other things that you can adjust within the App Center. So if you go into the App section, you'll see an option that says Quick Shutdown Set. So for example, they have what they call Quick Shutdown, and this was really necessary before they had the low power sleep mode. This means if you press the Y button to enable it, that it'll turn off instead of just going to sleep. I'm going to disable it because I think that sleep is good enough on this firmware. So long story short, it does look like everything is the same with the stock firmware. We still have all of the different systems. We have our games already preloaded and everything, and it does look to be the same game list that we'd seen previously. So it's not going to have every single game under the sun, especially a lot of Nintendo IP games won't be there, but you should still have plenty of games to be able to get you up and running in case you don't have your own ROM sets. And it's also worth noting that any custom firmware, for example, here I have my MuOS cards, these are all going to work on these newer devices as well. And it makes sense considering these are basically the exact same thing as the older ones. And I've done a whole starter guide for all the devices that are under the XX line. I'll leave it linked down below. That'll walk you through all your custom firmware options, and so that'll help you see which one is the best fit for you and how to install it. Either way, here we are with MuOS, which is my preferred operating system for this device. Now I have this set up that it'll basically close and it'll go to sleep, and then after a few minutes it'll actually turn the device off as well. And that allows me to jump into my games when I want to, but then if I'm going to be leaving this device for a while, it's going to be powered down so I don't have to worry about battery drain. Regardless, I think this is going to be my setup with the SP going forward. I'm going to use MuOS on the red device because I just think it looks really cool. I also love the contrast between this green DMG theme that I'm using right here with the red colorway. I think it looks great. And now that we have the device turned on, you can see that, yeah, we've got a black border around the sides, but I still think it looks really good, and it matches well with the black buttons here. So overall, I think this is a very good looking device. And so the last note I have in my testing here, and this is also something I noticed with the DMG model, is that the hinge itself feels a lot looser and smoother than it did on my review unit. One of the notes I had in my original review is that it felt a little bit more stiff and almost slightly squeaky compared to what I was expecting. Now the hinge itself has loosened up a little bit over time, so it's not so bad, but I still think that it's just a little bit stiffer than I would like. Meanwhile, the new colorways, including that DMG one that I tested previously, are smooth as butter. There's no friction here whatsoever. And it still has these same positions as before, so here will be your typical playing style, but it will also go further back. It doesn't seem to snap and hold as readily as before, but you can still push it if you'd like. Regardless, I like the feel of the hinge right now. I think it feels better than the other devices, but I'm kind of reserving judgment until later because who knows what it's going to be like 6 months from now. But as it stands, I think that the updates here are very slight, and it's really just about the color and then some of the improvements that Anbernic have made over time, over the past 6 months that this device has been available. And I do like the fact that they are making these small incremental updates to existing products. So long story short, if you like the colors that they have now available and you haven't picked up an SP already, then I think now is a great time to pick one up. However, if you already own one of the older ones, I definitely don't think it's worth it to buy an entirely new one unless you really want these colors. I do appreciate the fact that these buttons feel different, but I don't think it's worth spending an additional $60 to $70. Now, as far as my Linus Tech Tips screwdriver, I think it's really cool that they've made one. I love that it has my name on it, but I think I prefer my iFixit screwdriver over theirs just because it is a little bit grippier higher up. And it would definitely be nice to have a 1.5 hex instead of two that are 2.0. So in terms of a mini screwdriver review, I think that it's worth maybe saving the $10 and getting the one from iFixit instead. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I tried to keep it as short as possible, but you know me, I like to get into every little nook and cranny. And so I hope this was helpful for you if you are thinking about picking up one of these new colors of the SP. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.